The day dawned golden, and the young woman's heart beat fast, as if each pulse were a confirmation that her life was finally about to change forever. Raised in simplicity, where luxury had never touched her delicate hands, she believed that the white dress was not just a piece of fabric, but a symbol of victory over all the tears she had ever shed. Her eyes shone with purity and innocence, like a girl who still kept her virginity intact and dreamed of giving herself only to the man who had sworn eternal love. In that instant, surrounded by simple flowers sewn together with care by neighbors who loved her, she felt she was about to cross the church aisle to meet not only a groom, but an entirely new destiny. Inside the small church, the pews were filled with curious faces, some joyful, others envious, all waiting for the moment when the young woman would walk down the narrow aisle, carrying the promise of a different future. The dress was modest, but in her eyes, it was the most beautiful work ever created, because it carried the weight of many days of hard work to pay for every detail. Her heart pulsed with hope, imagining the children she would have, the house she would build, and the mornings she would wake up next to the man who said he loved her. Her soul was light, naive, believing that love was enough to erase all the social differences that had always seemed unreachable. While fixing her veil before a cracked mirror, she took deep breaths, trying to calm the storm inside her chest. With every strand of hair pinned carefully, she saw not only a bride, but a girl who had endured humiliation for being poor, who had heard laughter behind her back, who had grown up hearing she would never be desired by a man with a promising future. And now, there, before the image of the bride reflected in the mirror, she believed that all wounds would be healed, that this marriage would be living proof that love always triumphs. In her mind, the altar was not just a sacred place, but the bridge that would carry her to a new life where she could finally be loved the way she had always dreamed. Every step she took toward the altar was filled with dreams and purity. She did not notice the malicious glances. She did not hear the sharp tongues whispering in the pews, nor did she suspect the hidden intentions surrounding her future husband. For her, everything was love, everything was destiny, everything was promise. With trembling hands holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, she walked radiant, believing her life would begin in that very moment. Yet, at the back of the church, a sharp gaze followed her intently. A tall, imposing man with strong, striking features who did not seem to belong to that humble scene. An older millionaire, proud and hardened by life, who, even without realizing it, was already being drawn into the simplicity of that moment. The church was immersed in silence when the young woman reached the altar, her heart racing and her eyes brimming with emotion. Her lips trembled in a timid smile, as if happiness were so immense that it could barely fit inside her delicate body. Every gaze was fixed on her, some filled with tenderness, others heavy with envy, but none of them could prepare that bride for the cruelty that was about to unfold. The groom, in his well-fitted suit and with a cold expression, stared at her with a strangely distant look, as if the glow in the eyes of the woman before him were incapable of stirring any emotion within him. At the very moment when the priest began the ceremony, just as the vows were about to be exchanged, he took a deep breath, curved his lips into a sarcastic smile, and, with a firm voice, uttered words that shattered the young woman's soul before everyone present. "I will not marry you." The sound echoed like thunder inside the small church, making hearts stop for an instant. The bouquet slipped from the bride's hands, falling onto the cold floor as though destiny itself had abandoned her along with those fragile flowers. Murmurs began to spread across the pews, and the embarrassment turned into a horrifying spectacle. People exchanged shocked glances, while others, hiding malicious smiles, savored the scandal. The young woman, stunned, could not believe that the man who had promised to love and protect her had chosen that very moment to humiliate her before everyone. Her innocent heart could not comprehend how happiness could so suddenly turn into pain. The groom, devoid of compassion, revealed the cruel truth before the crowd. There was another woman, a mistress he considered better, more beautiful, richer, more worthy of standing in that place. He was not simply leaving her. He made a point of trampling on her purity and simplicity, transforming her most dreamed of moment into a spectacle of public humiliation. Each of his words was a sharp blade cutting through her soul as she stood motionless, tears streaming down her face, powerless to react. It was as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she could not wake. Her virginity, her innocence, and her love had been treated as nothing, as weaknesses to be ridiculed before all. Among the attendees, the millionaire who had been observing her felt something stir within him. His eyes, accustomed to seeing the world with coldness and indifference, fixed on that shattered bride, and a strange, almost forgotten feeling was born in his chest. While everyone murmured, some laughed, others recorded the scene as if it were nothing more than cruel entertainment. He felt a flame of anger ignite within him, not against the young woman, but against the cowardice and cruelty of the man exposing her to ridicule. In silence, the millionaire remained still, but inside, something had already begun to change. That girl, abandoned at the altar, marked by purity and pain, had just entered his life in a way he could never have imagined. When the cutting silence took over the church after the groom's cowardly escape, the young woman's tearful, desperate eyes wandered aimlessly, searching for a way to flee the humiliation that seemed to crush her soul. The whispers echoed like needles piercing her skin. The judgmental stares wounded her more than 1,000 knives, and the overwhelming sense of abandonment consumed her entirely. She felt she would never recover, that her life had ended in that very moment, as if all her dreams had been shattered before cruel witnesses. And in the midst of that storm of pain, her reddened, tear-filled eyes met his gaze, a gaze firm, profound, and unshakable, one that seemed to cut through the layers of despair and reach into the depths of her soul. Seated on one of the farthest pews was the man who, until that moment, had been nothing but a stranger to her, yet whose imposing presence radiated something different, something that did not belong in that modest setting. His strong features revealed a more mature age, his upright posture reflected confidence, and his striking physique drew attention effortlessly. A muscular, vigorous body seemingly sculpted by destiny itself to stand out anywhere. He was not only handsome, but imposing, and his presence seemed to dominate the space around him. His eyes, black and intense like burning coal, were fixed on the humiliated bride with a rare mixture of compassion and respect. There was no pity in his gaze, but rather a strange connection, as though he saw in her not only pain, but also the silent strength being born from her vulnerability. The millionaire, accustomed to dealing with selfish people, beautiful on the outside but hollow within, had never allowed himself to be touched by simplicity. Yet, before that abandoned young woman, who remained standing even in the face of public disgrace, something inside him began to crack. The pride and hardness that had built into walls throughout his life, shaped by broken loves and betrayals that scarred him, showed their first fractures in years. In her, he saw a rare purity, a beauty that went beyond the dress or the tear-streaked face, a beauty that emanated from within like a silent beacon in the darkness. It was as if the universe had chosen that very moment to unite two destinies, stitched together by the invisible thread of pain and redemption. As the desperate young woman left the church running, her veil torn and hands trembling, the millionaire remained still, though his mind was ablaze. It was not only compassion that moved him, but something deeper, a silent attraction, a calling impossible to ignore. He knew he could not rise and offer help right then, for his hardened heart still bound him to the pride that had always guided his steps. Yet he also understood, in silence, that this would not be the last time their paths would cross. His eyes, fixed on her until the very last moment, sealed an invisible promise. That destiny had already begun to entwine their lives in an inevitable way. As she left the church, the young woman's steps echoed unevenly on the cold ground, as if each beat mirrored the shattered heart she carried in her chest. The veil, once a symbol of purity and promise, dragged dirty across the stones of the street, following the despair that consumed her. The air felt too heavy to breathe, and the tears, now unleashed, flowed in torrents, smudging the simple makeup she had so carefully prepared. She was not only running to escape the judging stares, but also as one who longed to escape from herself, from the unbearable pain burning in her chest, from the shame weighing upon her like an impossible cross to bear. At every corner she turned, memories of the altar returned like daggers to her mind. The muffled laughs, the venomous whispers, the coldness in the eyes of the man who had promised eternal love, all reverberated inside her like cruel echoes that would not cease. There was no comfort, no embrace strong enough to ease such humiliation. For the first time, she felt that life had stripped her of everything. The future she had envisioned, the dignity she believed she had secured, and even the faith in love she had cherished as a sacred flame. Her heart, still virgin and innocent, seemed unable to withstand the weight of such contempt, and each tear that fell was the living portrait of a soul breaking into pieces. Finally, seated on a forgotten bench in a deserted square, she allowed her sobs to come with full force. The dress, now stained with dust and tears, stood in stark contrast to the image of the dreamy bride who, only hours earlier, had walked radiantly toward the altar. Now there remained only the wounded woman, the girl who had still believed in fairy tales and had been crushed by cruel reality. In her mind, the words of her ex-fiancé repeated like an endless nightmare. She was not enough, not beautiful, not rich. Those accusations, uttered in front of everyone, bled like open wounds that no passage of time seemed capable of healing. Yet, in the midst of the darkness of her pain, something invisible was taking shape. Though she did not know it, the steady, silent gaze of that unknown man followed her from afar, engraving into his memory the image of the humiliated bride whose spirit remained unbroken. While she believed herself alone, surrendered to the deepest suffering, destiny was already weaving itself around her. The millionaire, that strong, handsome man hardened by pride, still tried to resist the impulse to approach. But inside him, the image of the young woman in her fall was like a flame lit, impossible to extinguish. And in that silent square, her pain was beginning to transform into a bridge toward a new chapter that would change them both forever. While the young woman drowned in tears in the solitude of that square, in another part of the city the millionaire walked with firm steps. But his mind was far away, completely consumed by the scene he had witnessed. He was a man used to shielding himself from any emotion, surrounded by wealth and appearances, yet prisoner of a past filled with wounds that had made him proud, cold, and bitter. He carried deep scars in his chest from betrayals and interests disguised as love, and because of this, he had convinced himself that no woman could ever touch his heart again. Yet, against his own will, the image of that abandoned bride would not leave his thoughts, like a disturbing flame burning inside him. Seated in his luxurious office, surrounded by imposing furniture and walls adorned with priceless works of art, he felt empty. Nothing there could silence the memory of the young woman's tear-filled eyes, the bouquet falling to the ground, the torn veil dragging as a symbol of despair. He, who had so often scorned the feelings of others, now found himself irritated by his inability to rid himself of that memory. His pride, which had always made him believe he was immune to emotions, now wounded him. It was as if destiny had placed before him a reflection he refused to see, that of a heart still alive, still capable of being touched by something real. The millionaire tried to rationalize, telling himself it was nothing more than a momentary weakness, that it made no sense to waste time thinking about a poor, virginal and naive girl who had nothing to do with the luxurious and ruthless world in which he lived. But behind this resistance hid a greater conflict. He was tired of the falseness of the women around him, tired of fabricated smiles and caresses bought with money's power. For the first time in a very long while, he had seen purity, innocence, and truth in someone. And precisely because of this, his pride ached, for admitting it would mean tearing down the armor he had built over the years. That night, lying in his spacious yet lonely bed, he stared at the dark ceiling and fought against the storm that tormented him. His muscular, vigorous body, so often a source of respect and desire from everyone around, now felt fragile before an invisible enemy, the unexpected feeling. Pride screamed for him to forget, to erase that woman from his mind, but his heart, for the first time in years, beat differently, as if it had found something it could no longer ignore. And deep inside, he already knew, no matter how much he tried to resist, that encounter at the altar had not been in vain. Her simplicity had wounded his pride, but it was also beginning to awaken in him the memory of a man still capable of love. The young woman still wandered aimlessly through narrow streets, her eyes red from so much crying, when destiny decided to intertwine once more the invisible threads that bound her to the millionaire. Night had already fallen, and the city seemed indifferent to the pain she carried on her fragile shoulders. Her wedding dress, now wrinkled and dirty, drew attention wherever she passed, attracting looks of curiosity and even scorn. She, however, did not care, for inside her, shame and sorrow weighed far more heavily than any external judgment. Her faltering steps led her to an almost deserted street, where solitude finally gave her space to collapse. It was then that a luxurious black car, sleek and gleaming, parked a few meters ahead. The door opened, and out stepped the imposing figure of the man who had observed her at the altar. He wore an impeccable suit, but his presence went beyond clothing. He was the kind of man who made the air around him seem denser, as though he carried with him an aura of power impossible to ignore. His eyes, intense and steady, found her as if they had been waiting for her, and in that moment, time itself seemed to suspend. She, vulnerable and fragile, and he, strong, proud, and hardened, stood face to face as if the universe had prepared that meeting all along. Ashamed, the young woman tried to compose herself, but the tears insisted on staining her face. "You don't need to come closer. I'm fine," she murmured, trying to hide the fragility that overflowed in every word. But her voice trembled, and her posture crumbled before the intensity of the moment. The millionaire, without moving a muscle on his face, simply stared at her in silence. His mind screamed at him to turn away, not to get involved, to remain distant as he always had. Yet his feet advanced of their own accord. He extended his hand, not as a gesture of cheap pity, but as someone who recognized strength amidst despair. "You don't deserve this," he said in a deep tone, his hoarse, steady voice carrying more truth than 1,000 empty promises. She, surprised, lifted her eyes to meet his, and there she found not the pity she so feared, but something deeper, almost imperceptible: respect. For the first time since the altar, she felt she was not being judged, but seen as she truly was. A woman who still kept her purity, her innocence, and who had been cruelly wounded. The silence between them spoke louder than any word, and in that instant, both understood that this encounter would not be their last. His heart beat faster than he cared to admit, while hers, though wounded, found a strange comfort in the presence of this unknown man. His pride still kept him at a certain distance, but his eyes had already chosen her, and she, even amid her suffering, felt that something had shifted. An invisible thread had begun to bind their souls, weaving a story that neither of them would dare to predict. In the days that followed, the young woman tried to gather the pieces of her life, but the wound opened at the altar still bled within her. The wedding dress remained folded in a corner of her modest room, like a silent ghost that reminded her of the greatest humiliation of her existence. She returned to her humble routine, surrounded by heavy work and the pitying glances of neighbors, trying to convince herself that she had to be strong to move forward. But no matter how much she wanted to erase that cursed day from her memory, one image insisted on remaining: the eyes of the man who had looked at her with firmness, as if he had seen in her something no one else had ever noticed. Meanwhile, in a completely opposite universe, the millionaire continued his life of luxury and power. His days were marked by meetings in skyscrapers, gleaming cars, and people who bowed around him, not for who he was, but for the weight of the money he carried. Yet, even surrounded by abundance, he felt an emptiness that no wealth could fill. Pride kept whispering in his ear that the girl was nothing but a fleeting distraction, an inconvenient memory that would soon vanish. However, every time he closed his eyes, he saw her tear-streaked face, and once again, he felt the impact of the purity that both disturbed and attracted him. These two worlds, seemingly insurmountable, began to collide in an inevitable way. He, accustomed to refined women, excessively made up and driven by interests, found in her simplicity an enigma that unsettled him. How could someone without fortune, without status, with nothing but her innocence, awaken something so intense within him? She, in turn, even while trying to forget, felt that the presence of that strong, mature man was engraved on her skin like an invisible mark. She tried to convince herself she should not think of him, for the distance between their realities was far too great, almost absurd. But on silent nights, she remembered his voice echoing, "You don't deserve this," and her heart beat faster. It was as if destiny had placed two souls on opposite ends of the board, yet at the same time pulled the threads to draw them closer. The purity of the young woman and the bitterness of the millionaire became complementary forces, though neither of them was ready to admit it. He resisted, bound by pride and the fear of loving again. She resisted, scarred by shame and the trauma of being rejected before everyone. But even with all the barriers, something inevitable was growing. The silent attraction of two worlds destined to meet. Time began to take charge of bringing them closer in subtle ways, as if each encounter were a piece of a puzzle that destiny insisted on assembling. The young woman, still scarred by pain, found in him an unexpected presence. He was not a savior, not a hero, but someone who observed her with intensity, as if every gesture of hers were a precious secret. The millionaire, on the other hand, tried to keep his distance, bound by the pride that served as his armor, but his eyes betrayed him every time he looked at her. There was something irresistible in the purity of that woman, something that disarmed his rigidity and ignited a desire he believed had been dead for a long time. One afternoon, chance brought them together in a simple cafe, far from the spotlights and luxurious walls to which he was accustomed. She was sitting alone, distracted, when she noticed his shadow approaching. Her heart raced, and for a moment she wanted to flee, but her legs did not obey. He, imposing, simply sat in front of her without asking permission, like someone who knew he did not need words to justify his presence. The silence between them was heavy, yet filled with a nearly palpable tension. When their eyes finally met, something shifted. It was not compassion that shone in his eyes, but desire. It was not shame that appeared in hers, but a timid beginning of surrender. At that table, the millionaire who had always believed nothing could surprise him again, found himself completely undone by her simplicity. Every naive word that slipped from her lips sounded like music. Every delicate gesture carried a sweetness that disarmed him within. He wondered how that poor, virginal, rejected girl could awaken such a devouring flame inside him. She, still frightened by the strength of the connection, felt her body reacting in ways she had never experienced before. Her heart raced, her hands sweated, and her breath grew short every time he drew near. The encounters became more frequent, always surrounded by a strange mixture of resistance and attraction. He fought against the impulse to possess her, fearing it was only a fleeting illusion. She tried to resist the fear of being hurt again, afraid he was just another man ready to destroy her. But with each exchanged glance, with each silence shared, the passion grew like fire fed by the wind, until, in an inevitable moment, he held her face firmly and whispered, "You have no idea what you are awakening in me." At that instant, she understood there was no turning back. Love was beginning to bloom, and desire, until then dormant, was awakening with full force. As the bond between the two grew stronger, obstacles began to appear like towering walls built to test the truth of that feeling. The young woman, still frightened, discovered that it was not only his heart that carried wounds, but also the world around them, cruel and relentless, ready to judge them at every step. Social differences screamed like insurmountable abysses. She, poor, simple, discredited even by her neighbors. He, a millionaire, mature, the owner of an empire that stirred envy and greed wherever he went. The city whispered, and sharp tongues turned each meeting into gossip, painting her as a gold digger and opportunist. Yet deep inside, her heart knew the truth. She loved that man not for what he owned, but for who he was. It was in this setting of judgments that the greatest trial emerged. The return of the ex-fiancé, repentant and disguised as a victim. He reappeared with honeyed words, promising that it had all been a mistake, that abandoning her at the altar had been nothing more than a thoughtless slip. He tried to convince her that he still loved her, manipulating her fragility as a weapon to win her back. The young woman, though filled with contempt, wavered for a moment, not out of love, but because the wound still bled. The millionaire, upon seeing this scene, felt the pride that defined him being put to the test. His instinct was to walk away, to rebuild the walls of coldness and pretend nothing mattered to him. But his heart, already imprisoned by the innocence of that woman, would not allow him to retreat. There was a confrontation. The millionaire, in all his imposing presence, stood before the rival and made it clear that he would not allow that young woman to be hurt again. The scene was intense, heavy with tension and repressed desire. He did not treat her as possession, but as someone who finally deserved to be defended. The young woman, upon seeing the firmness in his eyes, felt for the first time protected, as though the universe had granted her an unshakable guardian. It was then she understood that this man was not just a powerful millionaire, but someone willing to set aside his pride for her, proving through his actions that his love was not fleeting. The days that followed were filled with struggles against the world. The rumors grew louder, the differences became more visible, but with every challenge, they clung more tightly to one another. She, with her purity and simplicity, was the cure for his hardened heart. He, with his strength and devotion, was the safe harbor she had always longed for. It was as if destiny were testing them, throwing stones in their path only to strengthen the bond being born. And even surrounded by doubts and criticism, something greater sustained them. The silent certainty that they were willing to face everything together, because there was no turning back. Love had become the living proof that two broken souls could rebuild themselves side by side. Night fell like a silent cloak over the city, but within their hearts, a fire burned stronger than ever. After so many trials, tears, and resistance, the inevitable moment had come when neither of them could fight any longer against the overwhelming force that bound them together. The young woman, still scarred by insecurities, felt her heart race whenever he looked at her with those intense eyes that seemed to strip her soul bare. He, in turn, carried the weight of both desire and tenderness, divided between the pride that had always guided him and the passion that now consumed him completely. It was as though all the past had led to this instant, the night when her purity and his intensity would meet in one body. In the silence of a luxurious room, bathed in the soft glow of dim lights, she trembled not out of fear, but out of expectation. She was still a virgin, and the memory of the humiliation at the altar made her believe she might never be worthy of such an intimate moment. But there, before him, every insecurity seemed to dissolve. The millionaire approached slowly, imposing his presence not only with his muscular, vigorous body, but with the unexpected delicacy of his gestures. He touched her face as if it were crystal, and in his deep voice he murmured, "You are my truth." There was no rush in his hands, only the promise to care, to make that night not a memory of pain, but an eternal mark of love. The young woman, surrendered to the intensity of the moment, let the tears flow freely, no longer of sadness, but of liberation. Their lips met in a deep kiss, filled with restrained desire and absolute surrender. His body enveloped her like a fortress, yet at the same time conveyed safety, as though he were protecting the most precious treasure of his life. With every touch, every sigh, the barrier of innocence she had carried melted away, transforming into a blazing flame. For the first time, she experienced pleasure, not as something merely physical, but as the consecration of a love born out of pain and now blossoming in fullness. That night, her virginity ceased to be a weight or a promise and became surrender. He, proud and accustomed to domination, discovered that in this simple woman he had found his redemption. She, fragile and yet strong, discovered that in his embrace there was not only desire, but the home she had always sought. When they finally fell asleep, intertwined, both knew that nothing could ever separate them. They had given themselves completely, and that love, sealed in the fire of passion and the warmth of truth, would never be forgotten. The days following that night were different, as if the world had transformed into brighter colors and softer sounds. The young woman carried in her eyes a light she had never felt before, the mark of a woman who had known love in its truest and most complete form. The millionaire, in turn, walked with the weight of change in every gesture. His heart, once hardened by pride and past wounds, now beat with a new purpose, nourished by the presence of that woman he not only desired but also deeply respected. The love between them was no longer a secret, but an open flame that illuminated every shared moment. But then, something unexpected began to happen. The young woman started to feel an unusual fatigue, a gentle dizziness that surprised her during simple tasks, along with a strange warmth that rose through her delicate skin. At first, she believed it was only the weight of emotions still settling inside her. But as the days accumulated and the symptoms grew stronger, a daring suspicion began to take form in her mind. In the silence of her simplicity, with trembling hands over her belly, she feared to believe what her heart already sensed. A new life was growing inside her. The moment of confirmation was a whirlwind of emotions. When she was certain of her pregnancy, tears once again streamed down her eyes. But this time, they were not of pain. They were of surprise, of fear, and above all, of intense happiness. The young woman, still remembering all the humiliations she had endured, felt that destiny was finally granting her an unimaginable gift. It was not just a child, it was the living proof that her love with that man was not a fleeting illusion, but something real and transformative. Her body, once seen as fragile and defenseless, now became the sacred home of a new life. When she shared the news with the millionaire, silence filled the room. His eyes, always so firm and impenetrable, softened as never before. At first, he only stared at her, as if unable to process such a revelation. But little by little, the rigidity gave way to a restrained smile, loaded with emotion. He pulled her tightly into his arms, as if fearing to lose her, and whispered in his deep voice, "You have given me the greatest gift of my life." For that man marked by pride and wounds, becoming a father was more than destiny. It was the chance to be reborn alongside the woman who had transformed his existence. In that instant, both understood that the love uniting them had grown even greater, for now it carried within itself the promise of a family. Her heart beat in peace, and his, for the first time in years, pulsed with hope. The pregnancy was not just a fact, but the certainty that they were destined to live something eternal, something that would bind their souls forever. The news of the pregnancy transformed everything around them into a point of no return. For the young woman, it was as if her heart had finally found a home. The life growing in her womb was the certainty that she would never be the same again, that she was no longer just the bride rejected at the altar, but now the woman chosen by destiny to be a mother and a companion. Each dawn seemed to bring a new hope, and even though fear lingered around her, there was within her a serene strength, an instinct whispering that by this man's side she would lack nothing. For the millionaire, the discovery was like a storm that forced him to tear down the walls he had built over the years. The pride that guided him, the weight of old wounds, and the distrust he nurtured toward people began to collapse in the face of the responsibility of being a father. For the first time, he stopped thinking only of himself and realized that he held in his hands the future not only of that young woman, but also of the child on the way. His thoughts, once cold and calculating, were now filled with plans to protect, to provide, and above all, to remain. It was on an afternoon of deep silence, inside the spacious living room of his mansion, that he made the decision. He walked toward her as she waited seated with her hands interlaced over her still discreet belly, and he knelt before her fragility, but with the strength of a man who knew what he wanted. Looking into her tearful eyes, he declared, "You will no longer cry for anyone. I will not allow you to be hurt again. I want you with me, as my wife, as the mother of my child, and as the woman who changed my life." His deep voice carried no doubt, no hesitation. It was the certainty engraved in his soul that from that moment on, they would walk together. She, moved, felt tears fall again, but not of pain, tears of happiness. Everything that had once been denied to her was now materializing in words and actions. There was no wealth in the world that could compare to the safety he offered her. It was not just marriage that lay before her, but the promise of a home, of a family, of a life no longer marked by humiliation. In the young woman's heart, the answer was already given even before her lips pronounced it, yes. And so, in that simple yet eternal moment, the two decided their future. It was not only about love or desire, it was about belonging, about rebirth, and about building something greater than themselves. The millionaire ceased to be only the proud, embittered man. and the young woman ceased to be only the rejected bride. Together, they became the living promise of a family, united by the love and hope now beating within her. Shortly after the decision that sealed their fate, the millionaire fulfilled his promise with the intensity of someone who knows no limits when it comes to protecting what he loves. For the young woman, the transition was almost unreal. In one moment, she lived in a small room with peeling walls where the wind crept through the cracks, and in the next, she was crossing the wrought iron gates of an immense mansion that resembled a modern castle. Every detail of the new home seemed to shout abundance. Vast gardens with rare flowers, hallways so wide that her footsteps echoed as if she were walking in another world, crystal chandeliers that reflected light in 1,000 colors, and enormous windows that opened onto endless horizons. It was as if destiny itself wanted to reward her for every tear she had shed in the past. Yet what surprised her most was not the luxury itself, but the sense of belonging that he made sure to convey in every gesture. "This is our home now," he said firmly, holding her hand at the main entrance. For him, it was not enough to simply offer riches. He wanted her to feel like the owner of that space, mistress of every detail, queen of a life that once seemed unreachable. And she, still timid, walked through the corridors with the feeling of living in a dream, touching the walls as if she needed to make sure they were real. The mansion became the stage for the beginning of a new chapter. He, who had been used to living in solitude surrounded by luxury, discovered the joy of sharing his spaces with someone who transformed every corner into a true home. Her smile filled the house with life, and even the employees, who were accustomed to the boss's sternness, began to notice a change almost impossible to believe. His features, once rigid and closed, now softened whenever she appeared. The young woman, who had once felt rejected and unworthy, now occupied the place of a loved, respected, and desired woman, not as a symbol of status, but as the living essence of that home. At night, as they walked hand in hand through the gardens illuminated by the moon, she leaned on his shoulder and felt that life had finally transformed. The mansion was not just a luxurious house, but a symbol of the victory of a love born from pain and blossomed through surrender. Every room, every window, every detail of that home carried the promise of a future filled with happiness. And deep in her soul, she knew that the man had not only given her a mansion, he had given her a new world where she could live the fullness of being a wife, a mother, and loved as she had always dreamed. Over time, the mansion ceased to be just a luxurious and imposing structure and became the home where their love blossomed with each passing day. The young woman, once scarred by the shame of having been rejected at the altar, now walked through the wide corridors with a newfound serenity, carrying in her womb the purest fruit of that love. The pregnancy advanced, and with every movement felt within her, a wave of emotion enveloped her completely. The millionaire, who once saw the world with hardened and distrustful eyes, was surprised at how much he was changing. With every simple gesture from her, with every timid smile, he felt that his heart, once cold, now beat with a warmth he had never believed he could find again. The mornings were filled with conversations, blending tenderness and expectation, and their plans intertwined like deep roots growing in the same soil. He, once accustomed to making quick, impersonal decisions in million-dollar businesses, now found himself choosing colors for the baby's room, imagining the child's eyes, the smile, the way those tiny hands would be held. The young woman, always defined by her sweetness, discovered within herself a strength she had never imagined. The strength of a mother willing to do anything to protect this newly formed love. But it was not only the baby that united them, it was the companionship that flourished between them. At night, when they walked through the gardens, she would lean on his arm and whisper her dreams, while he, in silence, carved every word into his memory like a treasure. The mansion, once a symbol of solitude, now echoed with laughter, promises, and hopes. He was no longer the proud, lonely millionaire, but a man in love who had found meaning in loving and being loved. She was no longer the humiliated bride, but the cherished wife, respected and soon to become a mother, living the fullness she once thought impossible. The birth of that family was not only through the baby growing inside her, but through the unbreakable bond that strengthened with each moment. Two distant worlds had met to form a single universe, where simplicity and power, purity and intensity, pain and redemption united in harmony. The young woman, transformed by his love, felt that destiny had finally surrendered to her faith in true love, and he, marked by a past of distrust, saw in her purity the redemption he had never expected. Together, they were ready to live the most beautiful of stories, that of a family born from the unexpected, shaped by surrender, and illuminated by the hope of the future. The day they finally said yes, before everyone, marked not only the fulfillment of a dream, but also the consecration of a story that once seemed impossible. The young woman, who had once been abandoned at the altar under scornful gazes, now walked down the aisle of an imposing ceremony like a queen, no longer marked by pain, but by the glow of true love. Her gown, designed with delicacy and luxury, framed her beauty in a dazzling way, and in her eyes there was a serene light that only the certainty of happiness can bring. By her side, the millionaire, strong, imposing, and proud, carried in his gaze something no one had ever seen in him before: the tenderness of a man who had finally found redemption in love. The wedding was not just a celebration, it was a triumph against everything and everyone. The voices that had once humiliated her were now silenced, forced to witness that this poor, simple, and innocent girl had not only won the devotion of a powerful man, but also the respect of those who had once despised her. At that moment, every tear she had ever shed seemed worth it, for before her lay the future she had always dreamed of: a home filled with love, a family in the making, and the promise of never being abandoned again. In the dream mansion, now transformed into the home of the new family, every room echoed with the sound of happiness. He, who had once lived surrounded by empty luxury, now discovered in her laughter and in the anticipation of their baby the truest wealth. She, who had once believed herself too small for the world, now discovered she was grand, loved, and revered as wife, mother, and companion. The love that united them was no longer just burning passion, but an eternal bond that grew stronger with every gesture and every promise kept. When, on a moonlit night, he took her into his arms as if she were the most precious treasure of his life, both knew there was no longer space for the shadows of the past. Pain had been transformed into strength, humiliation into victory, and abandonment into eternal love. He, marked by strength and maturity, and she, shaped by purity and innocence, had found in one another the reason to live. And so, between passionate kisses and shared dreams, they sealed the certainty that they would live happily ever after, because destiny, in all its initial cruelty, had only been preparing the way for the most intense of love stories.